Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, we're revisiting the interdisciplinary field of comic studies. Our guests are Candida Rifkind and Dominic Davies. Candida is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, and Dom is reader in English at City St. George's, University of London. They've authored the book Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. The title is part of the Crossing Lines series published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. You may recall the interview we did in April 2024 with Dale Jacobs, who wrote on comics and grief, which is also part of the Crossing Lines series. Graphic Refuge examines how comics, through art and narrative, portray the refugee experience and seek to humanize the representations of the displaced in our current mass media ecosystem. Further, the title explores the dynamics of what it means to be a citizen and/or a refugee. But before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File podcast, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this 4th and final episode of this series, we take a closer look at the field of comic studies, including its interdisciplinary nature, how it will continue to evolve, and how comics artists are responding to today's events. I'd like to look at the discipline of comic studies, and it seems to be very interdisciplinary. And I'd imagine that refugee comics are the same, potentially even more so. What disciplines do you see refugee comics intersecting with, and how do these intersections elevate your research? And Dominic, we'll go over to you for that one.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to start by emphasizing that we are in comic studies and that comic studies is a real discipline, and that it has a really rich tradition of scholarship that we drawing on entirely indebted to. We've both been drawing on it even in this conversation. So I think it is a very interdisciplinary book, and refugee comics are demandingly interdisciplinary, but I do want to sort of flag that we do have that debt and that situation, or that we're situated in that field. At the same time, I think to breathe meaning into comics, and to really understand their full historical and political import, we need to work interdisciplinarily. One of the fields that we really sort of is almost second to comic studies probably in the book is critical refugee studies, as Candida's mentioned. We take all kinds of ideas from that, including writing by refugee scholars who talk about, the very title Graphic Refuge. It's not graphic refugees. It's about rethinking refugeehood or refugeedom, or what is called refugeetude, what Vin calls refugeetude, rethinking refuge as a relationship between people. Actually, it's not a thing that you are. It's actually a way of being in the world, and it's something we could all practice, citizen or non-citizen alike. So that's a really key idea. It's in the title of the book. Another really important one for us from critical refugee studies is Elena Fidian-Kasmeya's writing on places and spaces, not faces. So there's a kind of fetishization in visual culture of always focusing on the refugee face, fixing their identity, learning if they're a real person, getting their name, verifying their story, empathizing with it, and so on. And actually, as we've already been talking about in this discussion, this can be quite violating. It can be quite invasive. And so critical refugee studies pushes our attention to the places and the spaces. And you've just heard Candida talking about the refugee camps as one such space, which, in turn is kind of connected to critical geography, human geography. But also, I have a chapter on the space of the Mediterranean Sea and the sort of significance of that and how that appears in refugee comics. And I'm indebted there to critical ocean studies, the blue humanities, also a really important interlocutor for us in this book is kind of forensics or kind of there's a group called Forensic Architecture and a sort of subgroup called Forensic Oceanography, who use aesthetics and artistic practices to help environments speak about human rights abuses. So they kind of will look at a ruin and they'll track the traces of the bomb that exploded and destroyed that ruined building to prove that a certain kind of bomb was being used, right? So it becomes very legible in a court of law. And so we're drawing on all these interdisciplinary ideas, and I think comics are in dialogue with all of these ideas. They are kind of doing their own forensic investigations of the different spaces and places that refugees inhabit.
Excellent. Candida, anything you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to add that one of our goals in this book was to go beyond the kind of work that we were doing before. So I'm as guilty of this as anyone, but reading for trauma. So a lot of comic studies that looks at autobiography in particular uses trauma theory and memory studies because Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is a Holocaust narrative, has been so fundamental to the development of comic studies in many ways. But we wanted to go beyond reading for trauma, reading for suffering. And that's why we really move, and this might be a bit surprising for some comic scholars, we move more into the social sciences that Dom has just mentioned, as much as the humanities, because we really are interested in things like critical geography, ocean studies, architecture and infrastructure studies, and conflict studies. That said, my background and my training is in autobiographical comics. And so I use diasporic life writing studies and kind of thinking through this long tradition of comics we see in some refugee narratives of drawing yourself. So what does it mean to make yourself a character? How do you draw yourself over and over again? And what are the kind of moral and ethical implications of drawing other people as part of your life story? So I think about that, especially in the final chapter on second generation refugee artists, where I'm looking more at biography and autobiography. But I do think we made a conscious decision to move beyond trauma studies and to kind of open up comic studies, not be so afraid as humanities scholars of the social sciences, to really reach into those fields and learn from them.
Excellent. Yeah, speaking of life writing as it relates to comics, I mean, we had Dale Jacobs on the podcast last year to talk about his book on comics and grief, which is published in the same Wilfrid Laurier University Press series, Crossing the Lines, as your book is. And in that conversation, he talked about how comic studies tend to look at the same few artists or genres. And Candida, you mentioned this in episode 1 a little bit as an impetus for this book, in terms of like looking at refugees as in a sort of a different light, and so he was hoping that his book would help expand the parameters and focus of the discipline of comic studies. And I'm curious how you think refugee comics fit into this perspective. Do you see comic studies becoming more fluid as a result of books like yours? Dominic, I'll start over there with you.
Yeah, we definitely wanted with this book to, we kind of, at the beginning, and as Candida mentioned earlier in this series, there are iconic refugee graphic narratives, graphic novels, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, Joe Sacco's Palestine, Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. There's a tradition of refugee comics that have such rich and in-depth scholarly conversations, dozens and dozens of journal articles, monographs, and so on. And so we wanted with this book, we return to many of the questions that I think animate a lot of those conversations. But we wanted to do it through this kind of new generation, I suppose, of refugee comics, a kind of post-2015, post-2016 refugee comics moving very much into the 2020s and thinking about the global changes that have happened since then. It's now more interconnected than ever. The rise of a kind of authoritarianism, the rise of a far right, and particular forms of strains of anti-immigrant hatred and disregard for human rights, a kind of disintegrating of that kind of international order that was built on human rights in the immediate post-war period in the 20th century. We are now moving into the 21st century and looking at something different. And I think one of the things we're trying to do, partly through the interdisciplinary moves that we're making, and also through the comics that we're looking at, are much more diverse, heterogeneous, not at all kind of. So we do look at some books, that are kind of books that you might read on a sort of humanities canonized list, but we wanted to open it out to much more kind of ephemeral, single panel comics, online sketches, protest placards. There's all kinds of things that are sort of taken into our purview. So we wanted to open out, I hope, what the book does is opens out refugee comic studies to this much more kind of fluid and agile way of understanding what comics are and what they can be and what context they can work in.
Excellent.
In terms of our comic studies becoming more fluid, it's actually interesting you mentioned Dale Jacobs' book, because his book takes a bit of an unconventional approach as a scholarly work. It involves a lot of autobiographical writing. He kind of merges working through grief for his mother's death with comics that he remembers reading earlier in his life when she was alive. And what I love about Dale's book is he's really pushing the boundaries of what it means to be a scholar, and those, old ideas that we have to be objective. We can't insert ourselves into the scholarship. And Dom and I don't do that much autoethnographic work, but we certainly situate ourselves, and we write in the introduction about who we are and how we relate to this project. And I think in the epilogue too. So I think comic studies are becoming more fluid, both in the kinds of works that are being studied and also in the way that scholars are approaching them, and understanding that our reading process can also be part of how we write about comics. I also want to say that there are new generations of comic scholars. When I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s, I couldn't do a degree in comic studies, and now you can. And it's really exciting for me to go to conferences and listen to grad students, some of whom are working on these kinds of texts. But there's also, I think, a lot of interest in recovering archival and ephemeral and sort of lost comics histories. And I do think archives and libraries have a strong place to play in that. There are some dedicated comics archives. There's the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library, the Library of Congress. But one thing I'm hearing is a lot of grad students are fishing around in other manuscript collections that aren't designated as comics collections, because quite a lot of writers and historical people who donated their papers doodled or sketched or, made a comic during one time in their life. So I think there's a lot of work to be done understanding the history of comics and finding works that were never meant to last forever, because comics are an ephemeral medium, at least in their earlier days. So they're not on archival print paper. They're in newspapers or they're in pamphlets that are falling apart. But I think it's really exciting to think about how comic studies is building up the history as well as opening up the kinds of works we're looking at in the present.
Excellent. Also in your epilogue, you talk about how the recent bombings of Gaza and the accompanying media coverage have been stark reminders of Joe Sacco's renderings of Gaza refugee camps more than 20 years ago. Can you talk a little bit more about his work in relation to today's events and how other artists have been responding through their work? Dom?
Yeah, the reason I got into comic studies is because of a splash page that Joe Sacco has in the middle of the collected edition of Palestine. These are a series of comics that he made in between 1993, in the sort of early to mid 1990s, during the end of the first Palestinian Intifada against the Israeli occupation. And in the middle of that book, the collected version, which came out in 2001, he has a chapter where he first goes to Gaza, and the kind of second page of that chapter is a huge splash page showing the Jabalia refugee camp. And it's actually drawn quite unusually for Joe Sacco from the kind of air, it's from like a kind of vertical, a bird's eye view, if you like. It actually turns out on the next page to be the view of the camp from an Israeli watchtower. But this is such an incredibly detailed and rich page. It doesn't have any panels or borders or frames or anything. It's just really a work of art. And there's so many details. There's kind of children picking their way through the mud. There's kind of donkey carts having, people loading grain onto carts. All of the roofs are just made of corrugated iron, weighed down with stones. There's so many details that tell you so much about the Palestinian experience. This kind of impoverished infrastructure, poor housing, so on and so forth. And that image at the time, I was very interested in kinds of infrastructure and the ways in which art and literature could get us to think differently about space and place. That kind of converted me to comics in a second. So it was then obviously, what else could one think of when in the end of 2023, the pictures of Jabalia refugee camp, which I knew about. I knew that camp intimately because I'd read Joe's interviews with people with Gazans living there from 30 years before, when these pictures of Jabalia refugee camp emerged, completely reduced to craters, with sort of no people in sight or people in flip-flops digging through the rubble. So that was kind of a real shock, really, a kind of visual shock. It was impossible not to see the one image through the other. And that's probably not surprising, given that legacy and that heritage, that so many comics have been made, particularly published on social media and particularly Instagram, to document the ongoing genocide, to protest it, to bear witness to it. One really notable example here is Mazen Kabaj, who's a Lebanese artist who actually made a sort of graphic diary, a kind of comics diary of his experience of the Israeli war on Lebanon in 2006. So he has made a comic himself about what it's like to be to sort of live under the bombs of Israeli jets. And he's kind of launched, in the last 2 years, a whole project on his Instagram page, which has circulated as exhibitions in various centres here in London and in other parts of the world, which is kind of goes under the title of "Don't Stop Drawing," and there's kind of themes emerge. They're very powerful posters, and he emphasises that these can be printed off and taken on protests, but also they begin to tell a story too. They're kind of a sort of documentation of the genocide as it mounts up, and as different strategies are used, as the death count reaches certain figures, as electricity is cut and used as a weapon of war, and so on and so forth. So it's a really, given how visual, especially on digital media, this genocide has been, and that perhaps we're kind of anesthetized in some way or inured to kind of digital photography. There is that emphasis of comics artists using their hand-drawn images to try to interrupt and to raise political consciousness about what is going on.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Candida?
I just wanted to add that, Joe Sacco is still making comics, and he published a series of comics last fall called The War on Gaza at the Comics Journal website. They've now been collected as a book called The War on Gaza, published by Fantagraphics at the end of last year. And he's continuing in his signature style, the trademark self-portrait, the strips of text at an angle, to reflect both on his own witnessing of what he's seeing happen in Gaza from his position in the US, and then kind of draw on his knowledge of the region. So here's someone, a cartoonist with a decades-long commitment and kind of returning constantly to that region and to the people that he knew. And I think what we're seeing on Instagram is a number of cartoonists. Another American is Ellen O'Grady, who spent time in Gaza working for the Red Crescent. I think she was teaching English in the 90s. And when she started posting comics to Instagram after the war began, she was actually focusing on memories of what life was like for her and the kind of graciousness and hospitality of Palestinians she met, to give us a different visual image from the war-torn ones that we were seeing in mainstream media. So there are ways in which cartoonists can change our perceptions, not just through offering a different point of view politically, but by reminding us of other ways of living in these regions and ways that are not necessarily images of victimization or suffering, that people have continued and been resilient in these contexts.
Mm-hmm. You also note that the ways in which comics artists are documenting today's events and experiences are indicative of a shift in the way refugee comics are read, and it's sort of forward-looking commentary. Can you describe that shift and what it might signify? And Dominic, I'll go back to you for that.
The hardest question for last. Okay, let me just have a think about this one. I think, as I mentioned earlier, really, that, comics, well, we've talked about a few points in our discussion, that comics are now moving through a really complex media ecology of images, text, multiple screens. There is also, at the same time as there's the rise of kind of digital consumption, there is also a kind of desire to return to the analog. So, print books are actually doing quite well. People want to, there's a joke in comic studies that kind of digital comics never quite took off in the way people thought they were going to do, because people wanted the weight of the book, in their hands, and they wanted to see the art printed on the page. And I think that's really says a lot, actually, about what comics bring to the kind of to the media field, I suppose, or the mediascape that we inhabit. But I think, what we're trying to do with the book is to open out onto a future for comics that are politicized, that themselves migrate across borders and boundaries, and that are able to sort of mediate and translate between people who are situated in very different places, and build forms of kind of connection and solidarity, or relations of refuge, as I think we call them in the book, between different constituencies who might not immediately feel they have shared material interests, and actually change the way that we see the world. So that, for me, is really where refugee comics are going, and where I hope comic studies will continue to follow them.
Excellent, thank you. Candida.
Thinking about this, I'm thinking about my own shifts in my reading. And, about 10 years ago or so, when I started realizing, hey, there's comics that are, by and about refugees, I just kind of embraced them all and thought, this is fantastic. Comics are doing this really important work. But then as I read more and I, learned from colleagues like Dominic and others working on it, I realized, hey, not all representations of refugees should be embraced. We shouldn't just de facto think it's a good thing that there are comics about refugees, because some are actually perpetuating those dominant stereotypes and cliches, even if they mean well. So we might see a comic that really focuses on suffering and victimization to try and create empathy in readers. But that's not very productive. And we have other artists who are doing something else, who are, not disavowing the suffering or the displacement or the tragedy and the loss, but are also showing that there is more to refugee experiences than that. And that also they are not other, right? That refugees should not be kind of set aside in little boxes in panels as these kind of others and through their difference from us. But we can see artists who might do something visually, like reject the comics grid, and like Joe Sacco does in his early comics on Palestine, draw whole communities as one kind of cohesive situation. So I think for me, I've come to realize that we need to read refugee comics critically. We need to understand that there are some that are very conventional, that may be well-intentioned, but are actually reproducing the ideas of suffering and tragic figures, rather than kind of subverting those dominant images and handing over agency to refugees themselves, thinking of ways the comics artists can show the relationship they have with refugees, or that the reader has with refugees, to make us understand that, they are not necessarily other, that we are all kind of implicated in this global system. So for me, it's a shift has to be about understanding the nuances of refugee comics, and also being critical readers and understanding that tropes are emerging and cliches and stereotypes. And we need to look for those artists who are attentive to working beyond those.
Mhm. Fantastic. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much for your wonderful questions.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
You just heard from Candida Rifkin and Dominic Davies. Candida is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, and Dom is reader in English at City St. George's, University of London. They're co-authors of the book Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. This episode was brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.